Good,
Hello.
good
Hello.
afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Packer. I'm the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle John Packer. Je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement des droits de la personne à l'Université d'Ottawa. Il fait beau aujourd'hui à Ottawa. It's a big blue sky with sunshine here. We hope it is equally pleasant wherever you find yourself. It's our pleasure today to have this session on coming in from the cold, Canada's national housing strategy, homelessness, and the right to housing in a transnational perspective. Coming in from the cold is a good way to start. I just came in from the cold. It's beautiful today, but it's a bit brisk and chilly in Ottawa. Hopefully a bit warmer where others may find themselves. Before turning over to Professor David Weissman, allow me just first of all to acknowledge the place from which at least I am speaking, and I believe David Weissman and David DesBaillets. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, the traditional guardians of the land on which we are speaking to you from today. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which is unceded and unsurrendered. And we pay respect to all the Indigenous people in the region and from across Canada. Let me also just quickly say thank you. I know that Professor Weissman will also say some remarks in moderating, but thanks first of all to Dr. David DesBaillets. He received, I think just last week, didn't you, David?
Yeah, that's right.
Conferred.
Exactly, Tuesday.
So yeah. He earned his doctorate earlier, but he actually physically got it conferred recently. Mm-hmm. So congratulations, Dr. DesBaillets. He is, in fact, a postdoctoral researcher here at the Human Rights Research and Education Center. We're delighted to have him with us, and he is not new to the University of Ottawa, where in fact he previously earned a degree in law. And we have also with us Professor and Dr. Sarah Hamill from Trinity College, Dublin. Are you joining us from Trinity College? It looks like you are, Professor Hamill.
I am joining you from Dublin, but I'm not on campus.
Okay, but you've got a nice scene behind you. I hope it's an equally blue sky in Dublin. It might not be, but we'll imagine it. Not yet. She will be joining together with Dr. DesBaillets on this subject. But just before inviting Professor Wiseman to take the moderation, let me also draw your attention to an event that we have coming very shortly on December 3rd. We'll have a book launch that we're co-hosting at the University of Ottawa together with the Institute of Indigenous Research and Studies. And this is going to be the book launch of Bruce McIver's now already attracting a lot of attention book entitled Standoff: Why Reconciliation Fails Indigenous People and How to Fix It. Very interested in the how to fix it. I think we all know it hasn't been doing too well, but how to fix it. So on December 3rd, please join us for that book launch and to hear from Bruce McIver and his comments. So it's my pleasure to invite my colleague, Professor David Weissman, who is a common law professor here, works in the field in particular, and he's also a member of our center. So David, for yours now to take forward.
Thanks very much, John, and hello everyone, and thanks for joining. And so I won't say more by way of introduction of our presenters today. John has offered some key details about them, and instead I'll put in the chat the link to the fuller biographical information that was provided with the registration materials, just in case anyone wants to take a look at that. So just so you know, the format for today is as follows. The presentation is based on a paper that David and Sarah co-authored. And so there's going to be a presentation to convey key points from that. And David's going to take the lead on that for about 20 minutes or so. And then Sarah will likely offer some observations or further comment, and then we'll move into a period for questions and answers. There is a Q&A. You should find you can put questions into the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those. And I believe there's also a function for participants to indicate by raised hand if they have a question. We can, I believe those can be put orally when we come to the question time, and I'll moderate that. So without further ado, we'll move to the presentation. I am going to run the PowerPoint, so you may hear a bit of traffic directions as we go through. Let me bring that up now. Well, that's not a surprise that it disappeared from my screen, but I'll bring it up again. Here we go. And one moment, please. There it is. And I think that's it. Okay, so take it away, David, and feel free to tell me if I'm lagging in my clicking.
Will do. Thanks very much for the introduction. Both John and Professor Weissman's kind words. Just a small correction to make right here at the top. I'm actually in Montreal and not in Ottawa currently. So the land acknowledgement is towards the Haudenosaunee people and the Wendat people. And furthermore, I want to thank everyone for attending today, and I also want to say some special thanks to the organizers, and by that I mean Viviana Fernandez, who I see has logged on, Caroline Fauché, of course, who is doing our technical work, and John Packer for his support today and really throughout my time at the HRREC. And of course, we have to acknowledge my research partner, my co-author in Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, Sarah Hamill. And finally, I do want to say thank you, Professor Weissman, for being here, for helping us frame this discussion, for helping provide some hopefully invaluable insights into the practice of housing rights in Canada's legal system, because I know that you also do lawyering, and I know that you've been involved in some of the really major cases, specifically with regards to evictions, the Heron Gate case, for example, in Ottawa, where you live. So let's begin. I'm really stoked about this discussion we're having. It's a timely subject, and I think you will agree that especially in a major global pandemic, these questions are more pressing than ever. So David, if you could go to setting the scene. I'll just give you a moment to do that. Oh, perfect. That didn't take very long at all. Okay, setting the scene. So about this paper, David, Professor Weissman mentioned that it is concerned with homelessness, with housing policy, and with the national housing strategy. And these are public policies that that intersect with the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact that pandemic has had on Canada's homeless population, and indeed in the other jurisdictions that we're going to be looking at. So I want to start by raising two key questions related to the presentation today that hopefully will make the link between my paper, I should say our paper, and the discussion we're having more obvious. The first question is, does Canadian housing homelessness policy as conceived by the National Housing Strategy, that's the NHS for short, and the National Housing Strategy Act, the federal piece of legislation that came into force in 2019. Do these together represent a human rights approach? And the second question is, to what extent can a comparative study of Canadian, Finnish, British, specifically Scottish, homelessness strategies be relevant to a Canadian housing first model? So to give you some of the historical context, in the past, many critics and housing rights advocates talked about Canada as being one of the few places in the G7 that didn't have a national housing strategy. And that further, that there a lack of an overarching policy framework has had a devastating consequence for both the supply of social housing in Canada and the growing homeless population. So this critique of the Canadian federal government mainly gained a great deal of momentum, and in recent years became so widely accepted that the current government actually developed and enacted just such a policy and legislative framework, in part to address the ongoing crisis in social housing and homelessness. Now, other jurisdictions are also facing similar challenges, and some of these, Finland, for example, have been much more proactive. The central government of Finland not only has a robust national policy and legal framework for the regulation of the housing market, but has also pursued aggressive anti-homelessness measures based on research, adaptation, and implementation of the model known as Housing First. Now, we're going to discuss that in some detail. What does Housing First mean? But for now, what you need to know is that Housing First and the national strategy in Finland has produced some truly astonishing results, and it has been noted by policymakers and homelessness scholars around the world, including right here in Canada. And consequently, today, Finland is one of the few developed economies that can boast that its long-term or chronic homeless population is in decline. Britain, specifically Scottish homelessness policy, are not based on Housing First principles as such, though they do share certain characteristics with Housing First. Namely, they regard housing as a basic human right, and their policy and legislative frameworks are designed to reflect this emphasis. Professor Weissman, the slide on hypothesis, please. So the central hypothesis of this paper is that homelessness strategies worked in Finland and in Scotland in large part because these countries adopted a human rights approach. Moreover, such policy frameworks ought to be studied, I should say regulatory frameworks as well, ought to be studied and possibly adapted for use in Canada, that is, in the National Housing Strategy. Particularly now, of course, COVID-19 appears to be here for at least the medium term, and I think it is even fair to call it the COVID-19 era. So the topic of our paper, which actually predates the pandemic, but does reflect the discussions in Canada, Britain, and Finland around the development of anti-homelessness strategies, public policies that address housing shortages, particularly in the COVID-19 era. So the paper proposes an empirical and a comparative multidisciplinary socio-legal analysis of these three countries, Canada, Finland, and Scotland, in light of their different national, subnational legal policy regulatory systems. that are all dealing with similar challenges. The methodology slide, please. So a few words about methodology. The study uses primary and secondary sources, quantitative, qualitative data on policies, laws, regulations with a direct bearing on the issue of social housing and homelessness in all three of these countries. And for instance, for sociological evidence of the decline in social housing and its negative impact on homelessness in Canada, we consulted sources published by the social housing homelessness sector and others that provide statistical analysis as well as macro level policy recommendations. For example, the Parliamentary Budget Officer's report on the NHS. These sources are sometimes called gray literature. It's a term that I don't generally like to use. I find that it confuses people. But nevertheless, gray literature was a major source of material for our research. There are case studies as well, albeit regionally in Canada on a smaller scale, but nevertheless, these are case studies that we felt you could use in comparison with Finland's experience of homelessness and Housing First, for example. There are transnational trends with regards to social housing and homelessness, and those are also part of the scope of this paper, especially if they involve Housing First programs. Now, the comparative analysis includes a significant formal legal and jurisprudential component, and especially in Canada, we start with the constitutional level, where you do find some striking differences between these three countries in terms of their human rights regimes as well. Finland's constitution enshrines a positive duty on the central government to promote the right of everyone, and I'm quoting here, to housing and the opportunity to arrange their own housing, end quote. And Scotland's Housing Act, as we will look at later, provides homeless people with certain legal tools and even judicial recourse to gain access to housing if they are registered with local governments. The theory slide, Professor Weissman. So we've been very influenced by many of the critiques advanced by international legal bodies and human rights champions. I would say chief among them would be the former UN Special Rapporteur of Housing, that's Canada's Leilani Farha. And for the purposes of highlighting the way in which domestic legal regimes both reinforce core human rights norms, undermine them when it comes to this question of access to housing. Throughout the paper, we use this framework, the one that's largely derived from the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, General Comment number 4. Many of you have probably already read that one. And the 7 key elements. I'm not going to go into detail about those, but those elements were a key influence in terms of our thinking and writing for this paper. There's a major transnational and comparative aspect to this theoretical lens as well. To develop this, we relied heavily on the analysis of Canadian housing rights scholars with a decidedly transnational perspective. And I'm thinking of people like Bruce Porter, I'm thinking of people like Jesse Homan, among others. So, as I said before, Housing First, the Housing First model is a critical component of our study. And I'm just going to say very briefly what Housing First is for those of you who don't know. Housing First centers on an idea of housing as a human right with flexible, non-judgmental services delivered with an emphasis on consumer choice, separation of housing from supports, harm reduction, person-centered planning, an active but non-coercive focus on recovery. And unlike some earlier models of homelessness services, housing is not offered after a series of steps or targets have been met by a homeless person. So in this particular approach, housing is regarded as the first step, not the step that eventually someone arrives to on the path to rehabilitation, but rather the housing is provided at the very beginning of a process, which includes all kinds of other resources and supports. If you could move to what is the Canadian approach to housing first, Professor Weissman. In Canada, Housing First includes a wide range of homelessness solutions and programs, and these are very disparate, and they can't very easily be defined. I can't give you one single model because there isn't one single model of Housing First that is currently in operation. So Housing First, though, does share, whether it's in Canada or in Finland, it does share certain core beliefs. And one of those, in fact, the most essential, is that housing is a basic human right. So in Canada, though, the emphasis tends to be less on the human rights aspect of Housing First services. And in particular, governments and state actors who are involved in the funding of these services and regulation of them, perhaps because historically, the federal government has not been that keen on discussing housing as a basic human right. That, of course, has changed with the NHSA and its recent declarations. But whether housing is a fundamental legal and, I think more to the point, justiciable right remains open to interpretation in Canada. So that being said, there are examples of very successful Housing First models throughout Canada. And they continue to be touted by governments at every level as a potential answer to the homelessness crisis. Now, that's hence the need for further research. But even the federal government's own reports on Housing First in Canada, often you'll find that they don't regard many Housing First programs as meeting the definition of Housing First. So the first thing to note from a legal perspective is that regardless of whether Housing First is in Hamilton or Medicine Hat, it's almost invariably involved in a interaction among the three levels, that is federal, provincial, and municipal government. And of course, this stems from the constitutional division of powers, and the federal government possesses unilateral powers, for example, in terms of criminal activity, drug policies, and so on. Provincial governments play a key role. They legislate social assistance. They legislate housing, mental health, health policy, child welfare. And then at the municipal level, you also find legislation and regulations on neighborhoods, zoning, for example, dimensions, certain aspects of homelessness, that is shelters, housing, and some community services as well. So just to give you an example how these three levels kind of combine, Toronto was the first city in Canada to adopt an HF model called Streets to Home back in 2005. And this program, the main mechanism in this program was used to rapidly house homeless individuals in Toronto using a team of experts, social workers, and so on, multidisciplinary, who locate people in, living on the street, and they connect them, they connect with the chronically homeless, and then they find rentals for them. They find housing for them, mainly in the private rental market. And that, of course, requires cooperation from landlords and building managers. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Now, Professor Weissman, the Finnish model of Housing First. So in Finland, of course, it is a very generous social security system, welfare system. And again, there's a constitutional guarantee of the right to housing. But despite that, in the early 2000s, there was a growing concern about homelessness in that country. And in response, starting in 2008, Finland developed a two-stage national program known as Pavel 1 and Pavel 2. Pavel 1 involved both multiple national ministries and several local governments so that the resulting strategy would be coherent and integrated Ministries and associations involved included the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, Criminal Sanctions Agency, and so on. For example, an example of one of the innovations in Finland, the Pavel Scheme involved converting homeless shelters provided by community organizations. So, for example, the YMCA into housing first units, which was controversial at the time. One of the main principles underlying housing first in Finland is, of course, that housing is a right. And the Finnish experience makes it very clear that the right applies just as much to tenants as it does to homeowners, as it does to homeless individuals. Professor Weissman, the Scottish model. Scotland was able to change the statutory duty in 2003. I should say that the statutory duty that was contained in the British Housing Act, and they were able to change that so it applied to virtually all categories of homeless people, and not just certain priorities as defined by the British central government. So there are certain hurdles in order to access housing in Scotland, and there is an eligibility test. And because of that, the Scottish model is not strictly speaking a housing first model. It doesn't accept all homeless applicants. It does actually discriminate based on certain criteria defined by local councils. On the other hand, Scotland has very high levels of social housing. About a quarter of Scottish people live in social housing of one kind or another. And that is one aspect of their housing situation, which is very different from Canada's. As with Pavel, Scotland has a program known as Housing Options, which seeks to prevent homelessness by finding solutions for those who are most vulnerable. Now, the slide on housing and homelessness policy under NHS. The question I think that really is at the heart of this paper is, does the NHS constitute a human rights approach? Given that the NHS-A was only passed in 2019, it is in some ways a bit premature to be talking about the application of it. And of course, the National Housing Council has been established. The federal housing advocate remains unresolved. That is, no one has yet to be appointed to that position. The NHS does make explicit commitments to the progressive realization of the right to housing, which is a reference, of course, to the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it does recognize the right to housing. However, until Canada increases its social housing stocks, the NHS likely will not be able to grant the sort of right that is seen in, say, Scotland, though it does do a lot of good, and it does make it clear that people, including the homeless, do have rights, and that governments have corresponding duties. Therefore, we can say that addressing a prima facie violation of the right to housing, which the NHSA does, albeit very tentatively and through its progressive realization. And when the NHSA talks about progressive realization, I think it's useful to think of that in terms of a programmatic right as opposed to a justiciable right. And of course, this is a step in the right direction. It is an acknowledgement of something that was previously not recognized in Canada, at least not at the federal level. So some final thoughts. The last, or rather the conclusion, the concluding slide, Professor Wiseman. The paper does reach some conclusions about the situation in Canada with respect to housing and homelessness policies. Are these conclusions still relevant in the COVID era? More importantly, do they apply a human rights lens to the homelessness situation? Again, we're talking about a federal act that came into force in the summer of 2019. So a little less than 2 years ago, and it is early days. So it is hard to make conclusions either way, but it does seem that Canada's strategy for countering the worst effects of COVID, and especially the federal national housing strategy, are in a state of flux. We believe that in some ways the NHS does represent a shift in the federal approach towards housing and homelessness, from a reactive stance to a more proactive one. Of course, the NHS also predates the COVID era. It does address chronic homelessness, mind you, and it defines that as reducing the number of shelter beds, in fact, eliminating them altogether by 2028, through a set of measures that would involve all levels of government, addressing shortages of rental housing stocks in the market, expanding the supply through a mixture of financial incentives to real estate developers, preserving existing stocks, growth of community or social housing services. There is, however, no mention of housing first in the NHS, either in the NHS-A, that is the federal act, or any of the related policy documents. And I think it's fair to say that in Canada, reactive rather than proactive policies remain the norm for most governments. And for example, in Montreal, where I am, there was an attempt to deal with the explosion in homelessness through the setting up of temporary shelters by the municipal governments. In one case, in a former hospital, there was use of hotels. And this was all done in an effort, very desperate attempt to get people off the streets, in particular because of the danger that this public health disaster represented. So these policies are very admirable, but they remain essentially reactive, and they are a band-aid on a problem that doesn't really provide a long-term or sustainable framework for reducing the overall numbers of homelessness in the city of Montreal, for example. So the NHS, the way that the NHS will intersect with those sort of municipal policies remains to be seen. And we, Sarah and I, both believe that the Finnish model, the Scottish human rights approach, are transferable experiments. They have proven results in finding housing for people and breaking the cycle of poverty. And at the same time, Housing First in Canada is, and this is something that we really want to stress, it's already working. It already produces benefits. It produces a more human rights approach. It produces benefits legally, socially, economically. And this means that Canadian policymakers should really start to study these transnational models of Housing First to see how they can be integrated into their own strategic objectives for the NHS. So with that said, I want to thank everybody for listening, and I want to turn over this discussion to my colleagues. Thanks very much, Professor Weissman and Sarah.
Thanks, David. I just want to make a few points, and I'll be really brief to leave time for discussion. So I just want to stress that the examples of Finland and Scotland are far from perfect, and we get into more detail in the paper. There's always scope for improvement, and I think one of the interesting things for me coming out of this paper and doing some of the research is there is increasing skepticism about Housing First and whether it is a human rights-based approach, and certainly some of that is around the lack of adherence to it. But certainly I think there is scope for more than just Housing First, particularly as I'm normally more of a property lawyer, so I understand the reasons why the sort of right that you might see in Scotland could not be granted under like a Housing First system. But I guess the point that I really want to conclude on is that the issue of homelessness is an issue which can be addressed. It can ultimately be solved. It does take a bit of political will and additional supports. It won't necessarily be solved rapidly, but it is something that can be significantly reduced, if not eliminated. So I just want to thank you all for coming, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, David, for for the presentation. And so I will invite folks to put questions in the Q&A, and we can respond to those. And I'll invite I'll invite David and Sarah to take a look. I might just stop the share at this point.
Sure, that's fine.
And so that we can do that. Sorry, go on, David. You were going to say something.
I was just going to say, yes, I see a question from Ravi, but I also know that you, Professor Weissman, you've got something that you'd like to ask.
Why don't we go to the Q&A first? So for the benefit of participants, the question has come in about the relationship between the National Housing Strategy and the National Housing Strategy Act and the Accessible Canada Act. And the question is, to what extent would a homelessness strategy be inclusive of the accessibility needs of Canadians with physical disabilities? So I don't know if either of you, David or Sarah, can speak to sort of the broader format of the National Housing Strategy Act and what attention is given to the needs of that community.
I can attempt an answer. First of all, thanks very much, Ravi, for participating, and I think it's an excellent question. It's a question that actually is not in the paper as such, but I absolutely understand where you're coming from, and I also understand that this is a category of Canadians that is part of the NHS policy framework. So that is, the NHS does identify certain categories of Canadians that are particularly vulnerable, and it does not say that these are folks that would necessarily be homeless. It does talk about the barriers to housing. And it lists Indigenous, it lists new Canadians, it lists Canadians with disabilities, and so on and so forth. So there is a component in the federal strategy in the NHS that I think looks at this question, not particularly through the lens of homelessness, which I think is what you're sort of driving at. And I think that's, this is potentially a subject for another paper, because obviously there is a connection between, the Accessible Canada Act, the crisis in homelessness and the need for housing that meets the needs of those with physical disabilities. And I would also add that in our own paper, the discussion about the international human rights framework does mention accessibility, because of course accessibility remains one of the key ingredients in the right to housing, according to General Comment number 4.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Sarah, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Ravi, for the question. And it's great to sort of see you virtually, if not in person. I mean, I would say that, any homeless strategy absolutely should be inclusive of these accessibility needs. And, we would hope that it would be. So your question called to mind that the situation in Ireland is actually significantly worse than it is in Canada, where you have people with disabilities who can maybe afford to buy or rent their own property. They actually can't, because there aren't either enough accessible properties or there aren't enough people to support, like there aren't enough caregivers to support them to be able to live independently. So Canada is doing, I think, better in some respects, but not doing nearly enough. So great question. and probably should be a separate paper.
Mhm.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I again invite folks to use the Q&A if they want to put a question. I did notice there's a question in the chat about seeing the paper itself, and I understand it is forthcoming, and I think you have the coordinates for that. I don't know, Sarah or David, if you, yeah.
It's going through the hopefully going through the editing process, so it is hopefully forthcoming soon. So
We might also, if you want to provide your email, we can provide you with I think one of the earlier drafts. Or would that be violating our agreement?
I'll check the copyright agreement.
Okay, all right.
But I think we
can,
yeah.
We'll look into that. Yeah.
Okay, so there's another question in the Q&A, and this one sort of poses issues of sort of broader policies for housing security for people, perhaps beyond housing first, but potentially involving that as well. And the question is that in North America, it seems that housing policies often take an approach of moving people from public housing towards private single home ownership as the ultimate goal. Perhaps reflecting an understanding of housing as, you know, a market commodity and a more privatized commodity. But this might not make sense, the question says, in certain cultural contexts, and perhaps other models may make more sense. For example, multi-family housing co-ops might be more appropriate as an ultimate goal for other cultural contexts. So the question becomes, have you heard of alternative models of housing policy approaches, you know, that bring in, I guess, to some extent, the concerns about, you know, different types of housing models for different sorts of communities, and perhaps even thinking about housing first, you know, sometimes what we can have in mind there is, you know, the lone individual, you know, often, you know, a man asleep on a sidewalk as the model that housing first is trying to sort of engage. But of course, homelessness takes many other forms. So I put that question to you then, you know, ought that to be taken into account, those different sort of situations? And do you think there's a sort of maybe overemphasis on, you know, the model of moving people to private, you know, single home ownership?
I think I'll just say a few words to sort of start us off here. That's a great question. And, you know, if you look at how the right to housing is understood in the sort of the international literature, it should also be sort of culturally appropriate housing. It's not just any housing will do. So that is a really important point. And certainly, you know, I have been very critical about, particularly in the Canadian context, this push for private home ownership. And if you read a lot of the housing sort of policy literature, there are many jurisdictions which do have that emphasis on effectively private home ownership, but that always creates a class of failed owners. It actually also it creates economic instabilities. So, I mean, I think there is a need for paying attention to what other models might be useful. I haven't heard of too many of them, which is disappointing. So if you have any recommendations, please put them in the chat, because, you know, we're here to sort of learn as well.
Yeah, I agree. That's a fantastic question. And I think, just to echo what Sarah said, the NHS does have an inherent sort of housing hierarchy, and it does sort of put the emphasis on owning home ownership as opposed to cooperative, non-market housing, communal housing, all of these things that are, or as you say, multi-family housing co-ops. You know, these are models that have been tested and in many parts of the world are the norm. So I think the NHS does, it reflects very much the housing culture in Canada, which is very much about, home ownership as being the ideal. And of course, 70% of I think it is, Canadians own their home. And so they naturally just think that this must be what everybody needs. This is how you live. But in fact, there are many other ways of housing people. But thank you very much for that question.
Okay, thanks. I'll move to another question now. This one also focuses on some of the requirements in the National Housing Strategy Act sort of framework, and questions whether they are consistent with some other sort of elements of thinking about what a human rights-based approach would look like. So the question identifies sort of that the UN has identified a few sort of three key elements of what an appropriate housing rights-based approach would be, human rights-based approach to housing, I should say. First, that the strategy or policy that's being used sets its directives, sets its objectives and measures its progress in the realization of human rights on a sort of at the level of people, not just at the level of systems and programs. So how many people are actually getting, their right to housing secured? That the progress in realizations happens as a priority among the most vulnerable groups. So you're addressing the needs of the most vulnerable sort of first as a matter of priority. And then third, that there are working mechanisms of accountability for the authorities that are sort of charged with this responsibility, accountability to the vulnerable communities or human rights seeking groups, including transparency and participation. So if those are sort of one reference point for thinking about what an appropriate human rights-based approach should look like in the context of housing and other, do you have any thoughts on the extent to which those elements are met by the framework set out in the National Housing Strategy and the National Housing Strategy Act? So sort of at the level of individuals, priority to the most vulnerable groups, and accountability mechanisms to those people and communities?
I'll take a crack at it first, if it's all right with everyone else. It's, first of all, thank you very much, Slava. It's a fantastic question. It's a question that is problematic in the sense that we're still in the process of defining what the different bodies associated with the NHS will do. In terms of accountability, for instance, there's really two bodies that are going to be paramount. One is the Federal Housing Advocate and the other is the National Housing Council. And these are set up as kind of quasi-judicial, a quasi-judicial mechanism, if you will, an alternative to the court system for resolving housing disputes. And furthermore, and this is another element I think that is very key in terms of progressive realization as a doctrine. If you study committee reports, the jurisprudence basically of various UN legal bodies, that progressive realization does involve consultation. That consultation, transparency, accountability, and other elements, things that were, harped on by Leilani Farha when she was UN Special Rapporteur, and who I might add, I think had a great impact on the shaping of the NHS. That these are elements that are still up in the air, that these are elements that are still being defined. We do not know the extent to which the NHC, the National Housing Council, the Federal Housing Advocate are going to play a very active role in consulting, in providing greater accountability, and so on and so forth. In terms of essentially applying the doctrine of progressive realization, which is referenced in the NHSA, how is that actually going to work in practice? I mean, it's something that I don't have a great answer for you at this point. I must say it's just not that clear.
Thanks, David. Maybe if people permit me, I'll add my own 2 cents, and Sarah's welcome to comment as well. It is those 3 criteria are very key criteria. I think that's right, and I agree basically with what David says, that I think the structure of the National Housing Strategy Act in particular is capable of meeting all of those criteria. I think, and in fact, there's some express language which would lead you to those conclusions. But it's also possible there's enough wiggle room in the language and in the the mechanisms of accountability, both sort of political and, as David says, sort of quasi judicial, that it could end up in practice being shaped a little bit away from those criteria. So there's, we have to remember that just because the National Housing Strategy Act exists, that the struggle is not over to then make it work in the way that, if we take those criteria seriously, which of course I think we should, to make it work that way. And it's not a good sign that the advocate has not yet been appointed. I think there's no question about that. And maybe I can use that as a segue to the next question, because it also raises something that may not be a good sign either. So this is a question about the change in, I'll just read this statement. A paradoxical change in the federal policy related to housing first was the scrubbing in the NHS of the mandating of a portion of the federal homelessness funding provided to municipalities, that a certain proportion be spent on housing first, 65% in the 10 biggest cities. As a result, the creation of Housing First programs in Canada has stalled. What does this change say, if anything, about the NHS's focus on the right to housing? Sarah or David, I don't know if you have an observation, a reflection on that.
Well, I mean, I think many people, speaking, if I may, for the 2 Davids, were maybe a little disappointed with how the National Housing Strategy in Canada is going. So, I mean, I think it's disappointing, and I would say, from my perspective, it depends, what the money ends up being spent on. In the full version of the paper, we sort of really highlight that Canada's lack of social housing is a major barrier. So, if there's more money spent on social housing, I would be very happy about it. But I would suspect, given the history of Canadian housing policy, that there won't be more social housing. And if there is, it might be the sort of voucher scheme that we see in other jurisdictions, such as in the US. You see it a little bit in parts of the UK. You also have it in Ireland. And really all that does is it props up the private market. It props up private rents, which are, continuing to spiral. So, I mean, it's not a complete abandonment of the right to housing, but I think we might sort of continue to raise questions about the level of political commitment to realizing the right to housing from this change, or at least that would be my take on it. But I'd be keen to hear
I wonder
David's perspective on it. So
I'm wondering about, so that's a really interesting point that, I hadn't even considered. Thank you very much, Tim. I wasn't aware of that, but I wonder, and this is speculation, I wonder if it has something to do with the arrangements made between these bilateral agreements being made between the different levels of government, and in particular the provincial governments that have signed up. And all 10 provinces have now signed some form of bilateral agreement with the federal government in terms of the implementation of the NHS. which is good, of course, but the downside of these agreements has been that, for instance, in certain places, certain jurisdictions, in Quebec, for example, the agreement, as I understand it, essentially gives Quebec a free hand in terms of the way that it chooses to allocate resources and funds. And I wonder if to some extent what's happening is, and this is a dynamic that you would find in a lot of federal programs in health and in education and so on, is that there is a tendency to favor those areas where the provincial government is less present, which gives the federal government more bang for its buck, if you will, gives them a little bit more latitude in terms of implementation of these federal acts. And therefore, maybe there's perhaps less interest in the Housing First programs, because Housing First programs are very local in Canada. They tend to be very, specific to a particular jurisdiction, to a city, and as such, federal governments really have a very small role to play in terms of the way that those models are active. So I'm wondering, that's just a question, actually. If anybody else wants to, take a stab at it and tell me what they think, I'm interested. I don't really know. I actually don't know what that says about the NHS, but I tend to agree with Sarah, not surprisingly, that what we've seen so far from the NHS, as far as homelessness goes, especially, has not been that impressive. It does seem like there's a real dragging of feet, and I will say this though, that the federal government did go from a less ambitious target of reducing homelessness by 50%, chronic homelessness, that is people who are using shelters regularly. They went from a 50% goal to a 100% goal, I think, in the last year. So, which is interesting. It signals, I think, a certain seriousness, a prioritization, I guess, of homelessness.
Someone had to be speaking while being muted, and I've managed to fit it just at the end of our session. So I noticed that we're just about out of time. Thanks everybody for those questions. And of course, one thing that I think it is really an open question: what impact the National Housing Strategy and Strategy Act will have, and many of us would have been thinking about that a lot with the tent encampments that were growing during COVID, and the way that those were handled, with obviously lots of concerns raised about what ended up happening in terms of eviction of a lot of those communities, and the role or absence of the federal government in trying to be involved in those processes in a human rights consistent way. So I think there are really a lot of open questions about where this is headed. And so thanks very much, David and Sarah. Your paper is, of course, timely in terms of thinking about where the broader act is at and which direction it could hopefully take us. And obviously Housing First is a key component potentially, and it's really important to ask these questions and compare the Canadian situation to other comparative jurisdictions. So thanks very much. I'll thank you visibly on everyone's behalf. I am and thank you everybody for attending, and certainly enthusiastic responses in the chat and in the Q&A. And we will, and I just wanted to note that we will, we'll endeavour to keep people posted about finding the paper once it's released there. Okay, so thanks everybody. I don't know if you have any final words, John or David and Sarah.
Just a huge thank you, and
No, I'll just
Really-
say as a last word from the Human Rights Research and Education Center, we're delighted to have hosted this, as David DesBaillets mentioned, increasingly timely and I would say urgent matter. COVID underlined the importance of this. I think to really the disgrace of our countries to see that these persistent problems, which can be improved at a minimum, if not resolved in many respects. And so I'm so glad that Dr. DesBaillets and Professor Hamill have been able to bring this to us today. Thanks again, David Weissman, my good colleague, for moderating this, and for those who attended. Much to be done, and I'm confident we can make progress. Please, for those attending, stay abreast of other events that we have on our 40th anniversary of the Human Rights Research Education Center. And actually in the spring, we will have a conference on the 40th anniversary of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, where we hope to look at, among other things, exactly the shortcomings and the gaps in human rights protection in Canada, not least on this kind of subject. So thanks to all, and have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Au revoir.